Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Athol Fugard's play, My Children, My Africa. Now, while this play is almost certainly not as famous as Fugard's masterpiece, Master Harold and the Boys, or even something like Sizwe Bonsi is Dead, or The Island, I actually, for my money, My Children, My Africa might be Fugard's best play. Part of the reason I say that, as you'll see, is because this is centrally fascinated by education and by language. And as a professor teaching English, those are clearly things that I have a big interest in. So the premise of this play, like Master Harold and the Boys, we have here two Black South African characters and one white South African character. But interestingly enough, unlike in Master Harold and the Boys, where the conflict is primarily between the white character and the two black characters, here the conflict is primarily between the two black characters, Tommy and Mr. M, the school teacher. And then Isabel is a white schoolgirl from a different school, a more privileged school in this town. This is 1989, this premieres, so that's worth knowing. Apartheid has not ended when this play premieres. And so that really guides the politics of this play. But the politics, again, are not the sort of simplistic anti-apartheid politics that one might expect. The conflict is fundamentally about how do you respond to inequality? How do you respond to oppression and exploitation in a way that is both practical and ethically legitimate? And we get this pretty much right from the beginning because Tommy and Isabel are having a debate, and that's where we open. We open in media res during this debate, and it's getting fairly heated. A lot of the other students who are watching this debate are engaging, and Mr. M, it says here, grabs the school bell and rings it violently. This works. Silence. And he says, I think it is necessary for me to remind you, all of you, exactly what a debate is supposed to be. Stage directions say he opens and reads from a little black dictionary that is at hand on the table. My dictionary defines it as follows. The orderly and regulated discussion of an issue with opposing viewpoints receiving equal time and consideration. Shouting down the opposition so that they cannot be heard does not comply with that definition. Enthusiasm for your cause is most commendable, but without personal discipline, it is as useless as having a good donkey and a good cart, but no harness. So this tells us a lot about Mr. M. He is a rules guy. He is an order guy. He thinks that the world functions best when you have sets of standards and principles that are applied consistently and equitably. Now that's important. We next get two speeches, one from Tommy and one from Isabel, stating their positions. And I'm not going to read the whole things, but they each give us a major theme or major set of concerns in South Africa in the 1980s. Actually, across some post-colonial nations, these are big struggles. Tommy appeals to traditional South African values, traditional family structure, indigenous African culture and pride, and the ways of organizing society in traditional South African cultures, the Xhosa, the Zulu, the Bantu, etc., etc. Isabel, by contrast, incidentally, the debate is about whether or not, so the proposal is that in view of the essential physical and psychological differences between men and women, there should be correspondingly different educational syllabuses for the two sexes. That issue is really pretty incidental here. Fundamentally, what this opening debate is meant to stage is these two competing ideas about how to engage in the basically how to engage in defining a post-colonial nation's identity. So Tommy appeals to pre-colonial values. This idea that Africans, Black Africans especially, in South Africa should return to these traditional values. Isabel says, for better or worse, South Africa is a hybrid nation. Not just because there is a white population, but because indigenous African cultures have been fundamentally altered by contact with colonial powers, and then in South Africa with the white power structure that remains. What South Africa needs to do now is to try and find a way ethically to move forward with this particular cultural reality. We can't go back to pre-colonial, pre-contact cultures. We need to figure out ways of moving forward ethically. This is the position of people like Homi Baba, for instance, who's a major post-colonial theorist who argues for the importance of cultural hybridity. She also says here, and lastly, a word of warning. The argument against equality for women in education or any other field based on alleged differences between the two sexes is an argument that can very easily be used against any other different group. It's an argument based on prejudice, not fact. I ask you not to give it your support. So that's another interesting element here. In part because rhetorically it does assume that the audience, and the audience of the debate, yes, but the audience seeing My Children, My Africa will find that a somewhat compelling argument. So that's an interesting assumption that Fugard makes about his audience and the way that they view gender equity as well as racial equity as ethical questions. So as the play goes on, Isabel and Tommy actually become quite good friends. They have a lot of fun debating one another, and they become sort of colleagues almost. And this is heightened when Mr. M says there is a national level English literature competition where schools partner to send teams to compete. And he proposes that Isabel and Tommy partner. They're from different schools. He proposes that they work together and they learn as much as they possibly can about English literature and go and compete in this competition. Because he thinks that they are both extraordinarily promising young scholars. And Tommy, the problem is, so they initially accept, and we see a lot of their preparation, which is really interesting in itself. But Tommy becomes increasingly radicalized against the inequality that structures Black life in apartheid South Africa. So he as these sort of troubles boil up in the location, which is the part of the name that they use for the part of the town where the Black population lives, Tommy becomes increasingly engaged in anti-apartheid activity. And interestingly enough, he actually draws on the lessons that Mr. M teaches, despite Mr. M's virulent opposition to active protest, to violence against apartheid forces, etc., etc. Tommy at one point says here, after they've been talking about Mary Shelley's poem about Ozymandias, right? And he says here, I had a book of Bible stories when I was small, and there was a picture in it showing the building of the pyramids by the slaves, thousands of them, like ants, pulling the big blocks with stone with ropes, being guarded by soldiers with whips and spears. According to that picture, the slaves must have easily outnumbered the soldiers 100 to 1. I actually tried to count them all one day, but the drawing wasn't good enough for that. Isabel says, what are you up to, Mbikwana? That's his name, last name. Trying to stir up a little social unrest in the time of the pharaohs, are you? And Tommy says, don't joke about it, Miss Dyson. That's her last name. there are quite a few Ozymandiases in this country waiting to be toppled, and you'll see it happen. We won't leave it to time to bring them down. And this prompts an interesting exchange with Mr. M, who critiques Tommy's use of the phrase we, or the term we, which Tommy defines as the people. And Mr. M is like, am I one of the people? And Tommy's like, you can choose to be, essentially. If you join the anti-apartheid struggle, then you can become one of the people. But if you oppose the anti-apartheid struggle, you are fundamentally not. And Mr. M asserts that he is, in fact, part of the struggle against apartheid, and he does this through education. But he also opposes tearing down statues of apartheid heroes, of Boer national heroes, of English national heroes that represent, to Tommy and to many of the people in apartheid-era South Africa, the power structure that prevents them from having equality. And this is an interesting exchange. I'm mostly going to just talk through it rather than reading it for you, but it's important. So Mr. M is opposed to tearing down these statues, and he says here, they are not our statues, Tommy. Wouldn't it be better for us rather to put our energies into erecting a few of our own? We've also got heroes, you know. And Tommy suggests a statue of Nelson Mandela, but then he immediately points out, that if Black South Africans in 1989 were to erect a statue to Nelson Mandela, the white South African government that maintained apartheid would pull it down. And Mr. M's response to this is, in which case they would be just as guilty of gross vandalism, because that is what it will be, regardless of who does it to whom. Destroying somebody else's property is inexcusable behavior. Now, this, of course, may sound very, very familiar to us in 2022, because over the past several years, there have been big debates about whether or not to keep statues of Confederate generals and politicians in the United States, as well as people like slave owners, slave traders, and things like that in the UK. But what strikes me about this moment, Mr. M has an ethical point here. The destruction of a statue put up, if the white government destroys a statue to Nelson Mandela put up by Black South Africans, that is vandalism and destruction. What he doesn't seem to accept as a legitimate concern is that the government has vastly more power and authority to do that than Black South Africans have to tear down white statues. So that's an interesting point. There's another interesting bit here that I think I'm going to skip. Tommy has a really, really interesting meditation where he talks about the Boer school district supervisor or something like this who comes to their class every year and makes this speech about how they're part of the future of South Africa because they're getting an education, and how this is the thing that prompted him to start saying, well, but am I really part of the future of South Africa? I mean, I look around where I live and there is no opportunity. There's only poverty and deprivation. And so this is what starts Tommy's radicalization, we learn. But I'll come back to this bit because I think this other bit is really important, but I want to skip toward the end here. Because we get at the end, again, Fugard tends to be a fairly didactic playwright. And toward the end of this play, we descend more into that didacticism, just direct political statements. But they are also complex and they're interesting. And so I still, even though it's didacticism is a risky strategy and I'm not a huge fan of it in general, I think they still work really, really well. The people find out that Mr. M has gone to the police during this period of revolutionary upheaval, and he has given the police the names of some of the organizers of this anti-apartheid activity. And so the people decide that they are going to come and essentially execute him as a traitor. Tommy goes in first to try and convince Mr. M to renounce what he did or even deny what he did and to embrace the revolutionary cause. Mr. M refuses to do so. And it's a complicated refusal because he is not defiant. And Tommy says this, he gets the sense, and I think we get the sense as well, that Mr. M is devastated by what he has done, as well as by the revolutionary activity that really sort of destroys the world that he knows. But toward the end, so the people do end up murdering Mr. M, and there's a final confrontation between Isabel and Tommy, in which she basically expresses her outrage for this. And Tommy says this: "Try to understand, Isabel. Try to imagine what it's like to be a black person, choking inside with rage and frustration, bitterness, and then to discover that one of your own kind is a traitor, has betrayed you to those responsible for the suffering and misery of your family, of your people. What would you do? Remember, there's no magistrate or court you can drag him to and demand that he be tried for that crime. There's no justice for black people in this country other than what we can make for ourselves. When you judge us for what happened in front of the school 4 days ago, remember that you carry a share of the responsibility for it. It is your laws that have made simple, decent black people so desperate that they turn into mad mobs." And that was an accusation that she had made. So we don't quite end there. There actually is a bit more of a hopeful ending. Tommy decides that he's going to leave town because of the political troubles, and he's going to go north and join the larger resistance movements going on throughout Africa. Isabel decides that she is going to find a way to live a meaningful and ethical life, trying to improve conditions in South Africa in memory of Mr. M. So we do actually end on quite a happy note, which I love. If you've watched a lot of my videos, you know that I like happy endings. But we do have that very, very strident political message that's so important to Fugard as a consistently anti-apartheid playwright. Now, there's one other thing I want to talk about, because I love this. It's one of my favorite bits of this play. Tommy and Mr. M are having an argument about whether or not words are sufficient to create justice and to create reform in the world. And Tommy doesn't think that they are, and Mr. M asserts that they are. So Mr. M says here, "Be careful, Tommy, be careful, be careful. Don't scorn words. They're sacred, magical. Yes, they are. Do you know that without words, a man can't think? Yes, it's true. Take that thought back to you as a present from the despised Mr. M and share it with the comrades. Tell them the difference between a man and an animal is that a man thinks, and he thinks with words." But then later on, this is my favorite bit in the play. "If the struggle needs weapons, give it words, Tommy. Stones and petrol bombs can't get inside those armored cars. Words can. They can do something even more devastating than that. They can get inside the heads of those in the armored cars. I speak to you like this because if I have faith in anything, it is faith in the power of the word. Like my master, the great Confucius, I believe that, using only words, a man can right a wrong and judge and execute the wrongdoer. You are meant to use words like that." I think that's absolutely beautiful.